Morning, folks. Gonna just wait for everyone to come in as usual. Hi, everyone. Hope your quarantine's going well. Um, Personally, I just upgraded the resident services tent on my Animal Crossing island to a resident services building. I'm in the process of moving my house, and that is about the most exciting thing that's happening in my life. Um, Looks like we've actually got a few folks logging on. Thank you. Good morning. Say hi. Happy Monday. It is the third week. Um, I'm just going to give folks a little opportunity to, come through the door, as it were. Take about another 30, 40 seconds to do that. But yeah, okay, so Animal Crossing is happening. Um, I'm down to like $3 in my checking account. Morning! And so that's fun, but payday's on Wednesday, so that's good. Let's see. Oh, Naomi says hi, everybody. Say hi, Naomi. Hi, Naomi. Do, 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 do. All right, we're going to go ahead and get started then. So we last left off talking about uh, uh, the party systems, right? We talked about the 6 party systems in America. I talked about how I personally think that we're probably in the 7th, but that's going to take some time to fully define. We talked about why that system matters, because the party system does mean new politics, new national rules, new um, opportunities for political engagement. So today we're going to talk about uh, how our particular party system today developed and what exactly it consists of. So let's talk about a concept that I've spoken of previously, but maybe haven't gone into a lot of detail on, which is party identification. Party identification is a strong attachment to one political party or the other, usually established at a pretty early age. Like I said at the beginning of my party's lecture, if I know your parents' political party, I can tell your political party with about 85% accuracy. So, party identification, again, strong attachment to one party or the other, and usually established at a relatively early age. Kind of wishing I wore a necklace now. Oh well. Political socialization, that process that we talked about when we were talking about the public opinion chapter, chapter 7. Political socialization often includes party loyalty. Um, Party identification is built again at a very early age. It starts with our families, and it does include our demographics. If you grew up in an urban African American home, you are probably not a Republican, right? We're seeing, broadly speaking, the coalitions of the two parties coalescing around particular demographic characteristics. The Democratic Party is the party of the youth, um, and we are actually seeing that gap grow bigger and bigger and bigger over time. The age gap in partisan voting is bigger than it has ever been. And so basically, if you are under the age of about 35, it's almost a certainty that you voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Good morning. Uh, if you are over the age of about 65, it's almost a certainty that you voted for Donald Trump in 2016. The age gap in the parties is getting massive. Let's see what else. Democratic Party is obviously majority women. So women are a few percentage points more likely to be Democrats. Young women, especially, though, are significantly more likely to be Democratic than Republican. um, Democratic Party tends to attract a lot of diverse folks, so people of color, people from gender and sexual minorities, right? So the gays and the trans, um, urbanites, so people who live in cities, people who value diversity, who are we talked about personality traits, who are high on that openness to experience personality traits. And overwhelmingly, the Democratic Party attracts those who are non religious. On the other hand, the Republican Party does attract the predominance of men, tends to attract most white voters, unfortunately. That is something to our shame. Um, Attract people from the suburbs and the rural areas, places that are a little more homogenous, maybe are a little less cosmopolitan. Um, if you're an evangelical Christian, if you're a Mormon, if you're a non Hispanic Catholic, all those religious groups do trend decidedly towards the Republican Party. Now, you will hear a lot about this surge of independent voters. There are a whole lot of voters who identify as political independents. Um, realistically, though, most political independents in the United States vote faithfully for one party or the other in election after election after election. About 12% of the population are true independents. They truly vote for a Democratic candidate in one election and a Republican candidate in another. But that doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing so because of a principled shift in positions, or because that they are they have politics that are very, very centrist or anything. Um, Often what happened, good morning, often what happens with independent voters is that they're very low information voters. They're kind of disconnected from politics, and they vote for whoever makes them feel most included. So about 12% of the population are true independents. As I said, they tend to be lower information, and they tend to just those are the people who wobble between candidates. Those are the swing voters that campaigns spend so much time trying to attract. They're not terribly reliable, and it can be hard to predict how they're going to move, which is why campaigns don't spend a lot of time trying to concentrate on swing voters. They spend a lot more time trying to mobilize their people, right? Let's take a look at this chart. These are groups that lean Republican versus lean Democrat. So you can see groups that tilt Republican, no surprises here. White evangelicals, also Mormons. So this is why Utah is a very firmly Republican state. Rural dwellers, about 54-40 Republican. Non-Latino Catholics, white folks in general, right? Men, people with less than a high school education, and the elderly, right? The silent gen, or white folks, white baby boomers. If we look down here, groups that tilt Democratic, you can see African Americans are the most reliably Democratic constituency, voting Democratic 76 points more often than Republican, right? That's more even than white evangelicals among Republicans, who vote Republican by about 60 points. Asian Americans, Latinos, Jews. So if you're a member of an ethnic minority, you're probably more likely to vote Democratic by a good 30 points, right? Atheists, the heathens, the religiously unaffiliated like yours truly, 68% Democrats. If you have an idea of that all atheists are like secretly alt-right crypto fascists, well, most of us actually are kind of on the left side of politics. People who live in cities, you can see urban people by about 30 points. Millennials in general do tend to vote Democratic more often, but you can see that the gap among women is just absolutely massive. 70% of millennial women vote Democratic, almost as reliable as African Americans, and more reliably than any other ethnic group. You can see women in general and college graduates tend to be more Democratic on average. You should also note that the population as a whole is about 9 points more Democratic than Republican. Pretty much the only reason Republicans still have a significant presence in our national government has to do with how our system breaks down power based on geographic lines, which our system, I went over this before, but our system awards extra power to folks who are in rural states. And right now that is predominantly white evangelical Christians. So they're predominantly elderly white evangelical Christians, by the way. And so that's predominantly a Republican constituency. Excuse me. So party attachment is a powerful thing. Excuse me. Pardon? So party attachment is a critical thing in politics. Party attachment filters three key areas of our political lives. From political participation to ideological filtering to ideology itself. Let's start with voting and participation. First off, your party identity is a strong predictor of your voting habits. This makes total sense, right? If you feel strongly identified with the Democratic Party, more than likely you're going to vote for Democratic candidates. It almost goes without saying, right? So most adults vote what we call a straight ticket. So that means that they vote for the same party for every office on the ballot that has a partisan identification. Remember that not all do in Nevada. We do have nonpartisan municipal elections. But so every office on the ballot that has a D next to their name, you just check every D, and that is what we call a straight ticket vote. Voters can also choose to split their ticket, voting for at least one candidate from each party. So, if you vote for Democrat for governor and Democrat for lieutenant governor, but Republican for treasurer and Republican for secretary of state, well, then what you're doing is you're splitting your ticket, right? Nevada actually, by the way, has higher rates of split ticket voting than most places around the country. Also, I'm noticing that everybody seems to be able to get to the 10 a.m. lectures and nobody seems to be able to get to the 8 a.m. lectures. So, if y'all think I should move Thursday's lectures to 10 a.m., maybe you should leave some comments down in the chat for me. I'm gonna leave that poll up on Canvas later too. So let's see. So straight ticket, split ticket. Furthermore, though, beyond just predicting how you're going to vote, party identification predicts how likely you are to vote in the first place, which also kind of makes sense, right? If you're a strong, passionate Democratic voter, well, then you're going to make sure to get to the polls every single time. If you are not really particularly tied to one political party or another, well then, maybe you don't go vote, right? And so it is actually, it's key to politicians and to political parties to get their members into the voting booth, right? And so 80 to 90% of the vote for any given candidate comes from what we call in political science, what we call base voters, meaning people who show up every election and vote loyally for whoever their party runs in that election, right? That doesn't necessarily imply, incidentally, satisfaction with that state of affairs. I mean, if you look at my voting behavior, I look like a very, very loyal Democratic voter. And I have a lot of criticisms of the Democratic Party. I have an enormous number of criticisms of the Democratic Party. It just so happens that I live in a swing state, and the Democratic Party is the one most likely to win, so under our particular set of election rules, that's who I'm most closely aligned to, and that is a good thing for that. Oh, there's an interesting question in this. Younger folks. Split ticket voting tends to be indicative of lower political information, and so people who are younger tend to be not as heavily politically socialized. So you tend to see younger people doing a little more split ticket voting than straight ticket voting. As far as racial dynamics, But you can see over here that different parties have different level, or different racial groups have different levels of attachment to the different parties. Uh, so I would honestly figure that, you know, um, probably white folks would be most likely to split the ticket because, as you can see, they're only about 8 points more likely to vote Republican, whereas among most groups of people of color, they're like 30 to 70 points more likely to vote Democratic. So I would expect actually that white Americans would be more likely to vote a split ticket. But that's a good question. You had me thinking on that one, so thank you for that. Um, let's see. Moving on. Party identification, as we've already talked about in the media chapter, does affect what signals people in the media environment are likely to accept or reject. If you're a strong Democratic partisan, you're not very likely to listen to Republican Party ideas about, well, anything. Makes sense, right? These people are not your friends, they're not on your side, so why listen to them? If you're a strong Republican partisan, you're probably not going to listen to anything the Democrats have to say, right? This even goes to the point of thinking our politicians are more in agreement with us than they actually are. People actually project favorable characteristics and acceptable issue positions on candidates of the party that they favor, whether or not those candidates actually hold those issue positions. For example, it's actually reasonably common for Democratic politicians to be at least somewhat waffly on the whole abortion debate. But most voters just kind of assume that any Democratic politician is automatically pro-choice. That's not the case, right? But people project, well, obviously, this politician's part of my party, so they wouldn't be one of those obnoxious anti-abortion people, right? Um, so party identification helps us filter not only the media, but uh, our own impressions and ideas about politicians. Let's see. Ideology. Finally, parties take divergent views on the issues. We have a situation in the United States now where party competition is perfectly sorted by ideology. That has not always been the case. As I've said before, it used to be the case where you really did have liberal Republicans and conservative Democrats in the recent American past. Not within my lifetime, but within my mother's lifetime, right? That is gone. That is just not a thing anymore. If you're a Democrat in the United States today, you're probably, a liberal or further left. And if you're a Republican in the United States today, you're probably, a conservative or further right, right? And so the differences between the parties have been diverging on every single issue, creating what we call partisan polarization. And let me see, is this where I want to talk about? No, I want to talk about polarization right now. Oops. It says it disconnected, but it doesn't look like it's disconnected. Okay, so I'm so glad that they updated their website because they now have this cool interactive flash chart. Their old website used to suck so bad. But this is the website of Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal. It's blurry. Voteview.com/parties/all if you want to get a closer look at this chart. So you can actually see, like, by Congress, what was the particular ideological score of that particular Congress. So what Keith Poole and Howard Rosenthal do is they mathematically calculate an index of liberal to conservative ideology that uses a whole lot of technical wizardry in order to be comparable over the years, meaning that I can tell, I can compare a politician from 1980 and a politician from 1880 and a politician from 1780 in terms of, how liberal or how conservative they are. It's really cool the way they do this. Um, but anyway, what they produce is this overall chart. They produce a lot of things, but among other things, they produce this chart, which shows you party polarization over time. Now, the era that most of our politicians and media kind of consider normal, is kind of around here, 1940 to 1980 or so. And you can see that the party polarization during that era was relatively small. Furthermore, if you look very closely in here, you can see, hey, there's a bunch of red dots among the blue dots. And there's a couple of blue dots among the red dots, right? There are some conservatives that are more liberal than some. There are some Republicans that are more liberal than some Democrats, and some Democrats that are more conservative than some Republicans. There's a lot of overlap here. These are like your New England Rockefeller Republicans. Look, you can see some of them all the way down there, right? In the depths of the Depression. And these are like your Southern Dixiecrat conservative Democrats. You can see all the way up through, what is that, 102nd Congress, so that's mid-90s? All the way through the mid-90s, you still see some overlap there. But then what you see is a whole lot of movement by the Republican Party in a more conservative direction. And you can see that the Democrats moved, so the average Democrat moved from 1940, let's just say 1960. Let's say 1960, Democrats moved from negative 0.3 to negative 0.4. Okay, that's a little bit of movement. Republicans moved from 0.25 to 0.5, right? Which is nearly twice as conservative as they previously were, and nearly twice as far as the Democratic Party has. So we are seeing increasing partisan polarization in our society, with the parties coalescing around particular ideologies. The Republicans coalescing around a conservative ideology, the Democrats coalescing around a liberal ideology, and the Republicans becoming more stringently and rigidly conservative over time, way more than the Democratic Party. Excuse me. We have this norm in our media where we kind of just assume that both sides do it. But in the case of polarization, it really is a phenomenon primarily on the right. So the differences between the parties have more than doubled in the past 15 years, and that is primarily the result of an increasing push for conservative ideological purity among the Republican Party. Just a quick reminder, if you do feel the need to stop me and ask questions, just go ahead and type them in the chat and I will answer them. You saw me do that earlier. If you feel like you need me to stop for a second so you can type your question out, just literally type like a question mark in chat, like that, and I'll hold and wait for you to get your words out, okay? So we're moving on to a conversation about faction. So we know from our conversation yesterday that our electoral system forces different factions among the political system to join together into two big camps, each representing roughly half the country. If they can do that, then they can win elections. And so it behooves us to take a look at what these factions are. What factions make up the Republican camp? What factions make up the Democratic camp? Starting on the political right, the Republican factions. Kind of this slide are the factions that are currently on the up and up with the party, though less so the Libertarians. I'll talk about that in a little bit. The next slide that you see over here coming up, those are the factions that are kind of on the outs in the party right now, or are kind of out of power. But anyway, Current Republican factions. We've got 6 of them. First off, you got your conservative populists, or the Trumpists, right? I didn't put that in there. That was your textbook. But the Trump's base are people who feel left behind by social changes, right? The world is not the world that they grew up in. They grew up in a world where, where Christianity was the center of our culture and our society, where, things like homosexuality were, frowned upon and not spoken of, where racial minorities knew their place, god damn it. And these folks feel like they liked that world, and that world is going away, and they don't like it, right? They feel left behind by social changes that norms towards increasing and normalizing diversity by ethnicity, by religion, by language, in terms of gender and sexuality, all of that. All of that stuff scares Trump's base, right? And these folks will often feel like both parties, although the Democrats more so, but both parties have turned their back on America, right? When they say America, they definitely mean white, straight, male, heterosexual, Christian America, right? These people are strong nationalists. They love rhetoric like America first, and obviously, and to the point that Trump refused ventilators from not ventilators, but coronavirus tests from the rest of the world, just because America was going to build them, which just seems like shooting yourself in the foot, but hey, whatever. And political scientists didn't really recognize this group as a major faction in the political party until the Tea Party in 2010, and then later the Trump campaign in 2016, which showed us that really there's a whole lot of people who are activated by this politics of identity and politics of racial resentment, right? Now, there's a lot of overlap between the populists and the religious traditionalists, but not all religious traditionalists are populists, and not all populists are religious traditionalists, right? Those alt-right, fascist, atheist Redditors, they're probably religious, or they're probably populist, but they're not religious traditionalists, right? And so religious traditionalists support a return to what they see as the Christian origins of our nation, which, by the way, if you look into the origins of our nation, our founding fathers were determined to keep this nation secular and not to discriminate based on religion, but try and tell them that. So these religious traditionalists support a return to the mythical Christian origins of America, and you want to enforce that by policy, doing things like discouraging divorce and discouraging sex outside of marriage, discouraging homosexuality, making it illegal to be gay, or making it legal to fire people for being gay, right? Making it more difficult for trans people to adopt updated identity documents and things like that. So these religious traditionalists support a return to Christian origins funded by the government and enforced by law, right? Next, we have the fiscal conservatives, folks who oppose government spending and are very concerned about the U.S. budget deficit as a central political concern. But I gotta say, I think your book takes them at face value, and I think that that is a mistake. So you see this trend happening a lot. Under Republican governments, government spending is fine so long as it's for, the cops and the military. Reagan doubled the defense budget. Trump bumped it up even more. So did, of course, George W. Bush. During all those administrations, you saw massive tax cuts. Well, actually, Reagan actually raised taxes. But during W. Bush and Trump, we've seen massive tax cuts and really little concern about the budget deficit. Actually, hold on a second. Because here's a question that I ask a lot in my classes, and that I'm actually surprised how few positive answers that I get, which is, do you know what a budget deficit is? And since I'm not in a classroom with a live studio audience, I can't actually ask that. But I'm just going to go out on a limb and guess that probably of the 90 of you out there, probably about 10 or 15 of you really understand what it means to have a budget deficit. Even though pretty much every single one of you has viscerally felt what it means to have a budget deficit. All a budget deficit is a situation when spending exceeds income. That's it. So the deficit isn't some big, scary, complicated thing. It is simply the extent to which the U.S. budget currently exceeds U.S. tax revenue. And so all these fiscal conservatives, they are fine with big tax cuts and increased military spending during the Republican administrations. But then as soon as a Democrat gets into office and wants to spend some money on social programs, it's, oh my God, the budget deficit. The budget deficit's getting so huge. It's getting gigantic. It's going to destroy America. Ah! And really, if you didn't worry about it when you guys were in charge, it seems kind of pretty transparent that this is just a hammer to whack Democrats with, right? That Republicans are fine with, spending money on tax cuts. And I should mention, now that you know what a budget deficit is, you should understand that tax cuts make budget deficits worse, right? Giving a tax cut in the middle of a budget deficit is like taking a pay cut when you don't have enough money to pay your rent, right? It's not going to make the problem better. So, if the deficit is simply a situation where revenue is smaller than income, making revenue even revenue is smaller than expenditures, making revenue even smaller makes that deficit bigger, right? But somehow tax cuts don't add to the deficit while government spending does, but only if it's not military spending, right? We have libertarians, folks who are strong defenders of individual liberty, a strong libertarian sees a very, very, very small fragment of what our government does as justified and thinks the rest of it should be handled by the private market, right? So for a real strong libertarian, the government is justified in keeping order and enforcing contracts, right? So cops, courts, and jails, and that's about it. If you want to have a road in front of your house, well, you can pay somebody to build that for you, right? They think that private contracts are a better and more free way of conducting society. And so you do see libertarians as a significant presence in the Republican Party. And while they may have some unorthodox positions, so for example, Republicans are more likely to support things like gay marriage libertarians are more likely to support things like gay marriage and legalized marijuana. Typically, though, libertarian voters in the United States tend to vote Republican just because they care more about the lower taxes than the legal marijuana. So the factions in the Republican Party that are kind of on the outs right now. We've got the neocons and we have moderates, right? Neoconservatives or neocons are folks who strongly support U.S. intervention to spread democracy and free markets around the world. Neocons believe that, hey, the U.S. is the world's only superpower and we should flex our muscle. If we really believe that limited government and free markets are the best way to ensure human freedom, we should be willing to spread those ideas, and so you can see the neoconservative project at work in, any of a number of invasions of Latin American countries, but also behind the second Iraq War, right? George W. Bush said, we're going to bring democracy to the Middle East. And he also said we'd be greeted as liberators and the war would be over in a month. We're still there. Oops. But yeah, so that's the neoconservative faction. The neoconservatives, as I said, kind of lost a lot of power and credibility during the grinding of the Iraq War and during the stock market crash in 2008. So they're kind of on the outs right now in the Republican Party. Finally, Republican moderates are folks who, are willing to compromise some of those things. People who tend to be relatively liberal on social and international issues, supporting, things like some combination of environmental regulations or LGBT rights or abortion rights or gun control or maybe federal involvement in education. There aren't a whole lot of Republican moderates right now. I would say we have two in the whole Senate, Murkowski and Susan Collins. That's about it. And even then, if you look at their voting records, while they may say that they disagree with many of their colleagues and the harshness of some of their bills, usually they end up voting for them. So that's the Republican moderate faction. I should mention, by the way, that most people fall into, two or three of these camps. It is not in any way contradictory to be a religious libertarian, right? Or a fiscally conservative Trumpy. Many people fall into several of these camps. Moving on to the Democratic factions, we have the progressives, the left, right? Some of these folks would call themselves Democratic Socialists, right? My people, right? Progressives occupy the left wing of the Democratic Party and tend to be especially concerned about things like economic inequality. These are the folks that are powering the Bernie Sanders campaign. And yes, he's still running, especially with primaries being postponed. Keep your fingers crossed. Maybe people will figure out that we need some universal health care up in here. But progressives are especially concerned about economic inequality and are especially concerned about issues like healthcare access, like, the 1% having all the money and the rest of us not, that sort of thing. We also have the Civil Rights Caucus, right? You saw that the Democratic Party tends to take in pretty much anybody who's not a white, straight, heterosexual, or white, straight Christian male, right? So if you are a person of color, or if you're a member of one of these gender and sexual minority communities, then you probably fall into this Civil Rights Caucus thing, right? Advocates for groups that have historically faced discrimination. Historically, the Democratic Party was also significantly supported by union workers, right? So unions were a major part of Democratic fundraising for decades, and still to this day are a major source of campaign contributions, a major source of votes, and of things like organizing space. A lot of Democratic Party offices pop up in union halls, right? It's actually a really important faction of the Democratic Party here in the Las Vegas Valley, where even though we are in a right-to-work state, really quickly, most of my students don't know what a right-to-work state actually means. They think that it means that you can be fired at any time for any reason. So that is true in Nevada. You can be fired at any time for any reason. But what that policy is called at-will employment. What a right-to-work state means is that you cannot be forced to contribute to a union as a condition of your employment. So, for example, back at my old job, where I was a grad student at UC Riverside, we had a union, UAW Local 2865, and we We could choose not to join the union, but even if we chose not to join the union, a certain percentage of our paycheck would be deducted and sent to the union anyway, because the union still had to represent us, and we still got the benefits of things like union health care and the union negotiated higher wages and things like that. So we still, as part of our contract, had to send, so it was like 0.75% of your paycheck if you didn't join, and like 1.1% if you did. And if you did, you got to vote. So obviously I joined. But in Nevada, an arrangement like that would be illegal. You cannot be forced as a condition of your job to contribute to a union. And so, anti-union forces regularly, for example, go after the teachers union and tell every Clark County teacher, hey, you could save $800 a year, just leave the union. Obviously, that makes it a lot harder for unions to organize and develop any political power in these sorts of states. So that's what it means to be a right-to-work state. But even though we are a right-to-work state, we nevertheless have a couple of very powerful unions here in the Las Vegas Valley that are majorly important to our politics. One of them is CCEA, the Clark County Education Association, which is the teachers union, and they've been raising hell lately. We almost had a teachers strike not too long ago, and that was a big deal. Another big one is culinary, right? The culinary union is a major force in Democratic politics in Southern Nevada. So organized labor, while a shrinking proportion of the workforce, unions are dying all over the country, still remains a major source of Democratic political organization and contributions. We have centrists, right? Your Clintonites, your Joe Bidens, people who are a little more fiscally conservative, who don't generally see America's distribution of wealth as a problem. I've heard the difference between progressives and centrists in the Democratic Party described as saying that progressives think America is fundamentally broken, and centrists think that it's okay, it could just use some minor tweaks, right? A progressive says we need Medicare for all. A centrist said, well, we can get the public option in Obamacare and let people sign up for it, and that'll be easier, right? A progressive says we need healthcare for everybody. A centrist says, well, people love their employer-sponsored healthcare. And I don't think that's actually true, but still. So, Bernie Sanders, I don't know, Jesse Jackson, or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, organized labor. Who's a big organized? Ro Khanna in California, I don't know. Harry Reid was a big organized labor guy. And then centrists think Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton, right? All right. So, what do parties actually do in government? Well, the work of organizing the party falls on three different groups. 1, the party organization itself. 2, the party in government. 3, the party in the electorate. When all three of these components of the party work together, and when they all come together around a shared commitment to the party platform, which is a written statement of a party's convictions and issue priorities, generally revised at the party convention every year. When you have a platform that people can get excited about, when you have everybody in the party coalescing around those ideas, you can make a very powerful political force. When you have the party being fragmented and not strongly committed to its core issues, then you get a party that can't manage much. So the first and actually smallest part of the party is the party organization itself. Each party has a central national committee. There's what we call the RNC, the Republican National Committee, and the DNC, the Democratic National Committee. Uh, there's also state level parties. So there's a Nevada Democratic Party, there's a Nevada Republican Party. There's also county level parties. So there's a Clark County Democrats, there is a Clark County Republicans, right? And each of these groups has a role to play in party politics. A lot of what they do is fundraising. These groups also coordinate election strategies. So the national party comes up with them, they send it out to the local areas, everybody works together, right? The party organization decides which races to fund and where their money should go. The national committees organize the national convention and prepare that party platform, right? The statement of what it means to be a Democrat and why we should vote for Democratic politicians generally in this particular upcoming election. So this is the party that includes activists, state and local leaders, fundraisers, PR experts, and includes yours truly. I'm a member of the Clark County Democratic Central Committee, right? So that's a thing, right? These are the people who actually do the work of maintaining the party organization and passing policies and deciding what it means to be a Democrat, what it means to be a Republican, and how those priorities are going to be expressed in coming years. Right? This is also the part of the organization that issues and enforces rules for the primary election. So a lot of people, for example, got really upset with the Democratic National Committee in 2016 because a lot of people thought they played a lot of favoritism towards Hillary Clinton and against Bernie Sanders. Right? There are some critics who say that they're doing the same thing in 2020. So we have party organization, then we have party in the government. The political party's organization, the part of the party's organization that includes the people who actually get elected and run for office. These are the people who typically get the recognition for pulling off whatever it is the party does. And I should mention that there's a lot of overlap between party organization and party in government. A lot of those, chairs of the DNC, chairs of the RNC, members of those committees tend to be high-profile politicians, right? Debbie Wasserman Schultz was the chairwoman of the DNC for the 2016 election. She was a former senator, right? So oftentimes these folks tend to be, well-connected politicians. And the people who win these elections are often seen as the leaders of their party, right? So the president is seen as the leader of their party, which good luck with that, Republicans. Whereas the highest ranking opposition leader is typically seen as the head of that party. So Democrats are kind of, aligned behind Nancy Pelosi as their head in Washington right now, right? Finally, we have the party in the electorate, which is the largest and least organized component of a political party. Registered members and regular supporters of that party. Members of the public. The party in the electorate is so disorganized that most people who consider themselves part of a political party aren't actually members of that political party. Unless you have an actual card, unless you have an actual, badge, a card from the Democratic Party that says you're a member, unless you paid dues or signed up. A lot of people think that just checking Democrat or Republican on their voter registration is all that it takes to become a member of the party, and that's not actually true. These are formal organizations with formal membership criteria. But we don't talk about that in politics, right? If somebody registers Democrat, we assume they're a Democrat, right? That's what that means. So that means that the party has very little control over their members in the electorate. And oftentimes party politics is a dance of persuasion between these two other parts of the party organization and the rank and file members of that party who go to the polls to vote, who are actually the ones who have to show up on election day in order to make sure that that party's officials get elected. All right, so we're going to talk a bit about partisanship and competition in the electorate and parties in the modern American democracy. So we are going to talk a bit about how parties are on the downslide. So we do see an election system today where Americans are much more likely to identify with movements and organizations than with political parties, and the central role of political parties in organizing elections has slipped. We have also, though, seen a party system where party leadership has become much more powerful. We've seen a much more ideological, pure party system, especially on the political right. The Republican Party is extraordinarily, ideologically committed to the principles of conservatism by this point, much more than the Democratic Party is committed to the ideological principles of progressivism, right? And in the recent era, we have seen polarization driving gridlock. So, as I've said before, our political system is set up in order to require a significant amount of consensus in order for politics to work. But we have a society where the entire country is divided into one of two camps, and those camps are growing further and further and further and further apart. I showed you what that looked like in the legislature, but if you can take a look at this next slide here, you can see what that looks like among the country. These are gaps in terms of partisan differences on, questions about government policy. The percentage who say the government should help the needy. The percentage who say that racial discrimination is a problem. The percentage who say that immigrants are good for the country, right? You can see that Democrats overwhelmingly think that the government should do more to help the needy. Republicans don't, right? Democrats, especially, and there's been a major increase on this during the Obama years, but especially recently, Democrats overwhelmingly say that racial discrimination is a problem for African Americans in the country. Republicans don't. Democrats overwhelmingly think that immigrants do good things for the country. Republicans, not so much. And you can see that in each of these cases, there was a time in the relatively recent past. I mean, I remember 1996, right? I'm not that old. Even as recently on this question about immigration, as recently as 2006, when the Republicans and Democrats were very, very close to each other. And then we've seen a massive divergence in recent years. That causes bad public policy, because no longer is our government being run by people who are trying to do the best policy they can, but they're trying to govern based on what they can actually possibly pass in our system in a situation of extremely high polarization. This leads to the public getting turned off about government, because goddamn, those crooks can't even do their jobs, and, people tune out, right? So in times of divided government, which are periods like we have now, where at least one party controls one House of Congress and the other party controls the other House of Congress and the White House, those periods of divided government have become less and less productive. It used to be in the past that divided government was no less productive than unified government, but in recent years we've seen our entire political system grind to a crushing halt. And indeed, for many of you, that may be your only experience of politics, because it's been true since like 2008, which is 12 years now. So if you're 20, and you started paying attention to politics when you were a teenager, your only experience of politics may have been a system that cannot get anything done. And good God, that is not good for encouraging ongoing participation. So I will conclude this lecture on parties and partisanship by talking about possible recipes for reform. First off, proportional representation. Many systems that have electoral rules can be different across different countries. And many democratic countries choose, instead of electing, whoever gets the most votes to one seat, they choose to allocate seats in the legislature based on the proportion of the vote each party gets. And so typically, instead of having single districts that represent geographic areas, they'll have one national parliament, and that one national parliament will be decided in one big election. During that election, you may not even vote for a politician, just for a particular political party. And then, if the Progressive Party gets 20% of the seats, then they get, or 20% of the votes, they get 20% of the seats in Parliament, and so on and so forth. Could imagine electing an American state house this way. It would require pretty significant constitutional reforms to allow proportional representation in our politics. But one thing that we could do that's not quite proportional representation, but that still might make it easier for third parties and to get traction, for people to get traction from the fringes of the existing parties, would be something called single transferable vote, something that they're already doing in Maine, and something that we did here for the Nevada caucuses, if you early voted in the Nevada caucuses this year, where basically, instead of just having one vote, you get to rank the choices on your ballot. And so, when I went to vote my Nevada caucus, it was Bernie Sanders 1, Elizabeth Warren 2, and then nobody else, because that's how I felt. But I could very easily, if we did that for the national presidential election, I could imagine several candidates running for president, and Bernie Sanders 1, Joe Biden 2, Mitt Romney 3, and then Donald Trump not getting one of my numbers. So single transferable vote would allow people to vote for their conscience on the first ballot, and then vote for the major party that best represents them on the second ballot. So you could vote for a third party, and then if that third party loses, your vote will go to the major party that's closer to you, and you won't waste your vote. So that's actually something that they're doing in Maine that we could actually roll out here without too much tinkering. Second, we could just reduce the barriers to third-party competition in elections. Right now, if you're a third party, it takes an enormous amount of time just to get on the ballot. You have to petition, there's filing fees, whereas if you're a member of the Democratic or Republican Party, you're automatically on the ballot already. Why aren't third-party presidential candidates invited onto the debate stage? That'd be pretty easy to do. Doesn't require a constitutional change. Just that alone would expand the range of viewpoints that we see. And finally, there have been attempts to try and reduce partisanship in government. But as long as we have these deep-seated ideological disagreements, it's going to be very, very difficult to do. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and break the stream here. So I hope all 6 of you that are watching right now will stick with me when I come back in about 2 or 3 minutes and we start our conversation of interest groups.